In the dusty streets of Charleston, South Carolina, where the antebellum mansions cast long shadows over cobblestone paths, a scene unfolded that would challenge everything the townspeople believed about civilization and savagery. The year was 1847, and the slave market buzzed with its usual cruel commerce. But on this particular morning, something extraordinary was about to happen that would shake the very foundations of their society. Margaret Whitmore stepped down from her father's carriage, her emerald silk dress rustling against the humid air. At 23, she was considered one of Charleston's most eligible daughters, with porcelain skin and eyes the color of winter storms. Her father, Judge Cornelius Whitmore, had brought her to witness what he called the natural order of things, a lesson he believed would cure her of what he termed her dangerous sympathies toward the enslaved population. The auction block stood in the center of the square, surrounded by a crowd of wealthy planters and merchants. Their faces were masks of cold calculation as they evaluated human flesh like livestock. Margaret's stomach churned at the sight, but she maintained her composure, knowing that any display of emotion would only fuel her father's lectures about female sensibilities and social propriety. Then she saw him, chained at the wrists and ankles, standing nearly 7 feet tall with muscles that spoke of years of hard labor, was a man whose presence commanded attention despite his bondage. His skin was dark as polished mahogany, scarred from countless whippings, yet his posture remained proud and defiant. But it wasn't his physical presence that captured Margaret's attention. It was his eyes. They held an intelligence and dignity that contradicted everything she had been taught about his kind. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Drummond, began his pitch with theatrical flair. "Gentlemen, behold Cato, a prime specimen from the Ashford plantation in Georgia. Strong as an ox, works from dawn to dusk without complaint. Though I must warn you he has a history of resistance. 3 escape attempts, 2 overseers hospitalized. But with the right firm hand, he'll serve you well." The bidding began at $500. Margaret watched in horror as the price climbed, each increment representing not just money, but the reduction of a human soul to mere commodity. Her father leaned over, whispering, "You see, my dear, this is the way of the world. Some are born to rule, others to serve. It's God's design, and we mustn't question it." But Margaret was questioning everything. As she studied Cato's face, she noticed something the others had missed. When the auctioneer spoke, Cato's lips moved almost imperceptibly, as if he were translating the words. When a young child in the crowd dropped a toy, Cato's eyes followed it with concern. These were not the reactions of a savage beast, but of a thinking, feeling human being. The bidding reached $800 when Colonel Beauregard, a notoriously cruel plantation owner from Savannah, raised his paddle. Margaret had heard whispers about Beauregard's treatment of his slaves. The beatings, the starvation, the unspeakable punishments. The thought of this noble man falling into such hands filled her with a desperation she had never experienced. "900!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. The crowd fell silent. Every head turned toward her, faces displaying shock, confusion, and outrage. Her father's face went pale, then red with embarrassment and fury. "Margaret, what are you doing?" he hissed through clenched teeth. 1,000, Colonel Beauregard countered, his cold eyes fixed on Margaret with amused malice. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized the magnitude of what she was doing. She was challenging not just one man, but an entire system. Yet something deep within her, something she couldn't name or explain, compelled her forward. $1,200, she declared, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Women weren't supposed to participate in slave auctions, especially not well-bred ladies from prominent families. But Margaret's father was Judge Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in Charleston, and no one dared openly challenge her right to bid. Cato's eyes met hers across the square. For a moment, she saw surprise flicker in his gaze, followed by something that looked almost like hope. But then his expression hardened again, as if he refused to allow himself to believe in the possibility of mercy from any white person. 1,500, Beauregard snarled, his voice carrying a threat that made several nearby spectators step back. Margaret's mind raced. She had access to her trust fund, money her grandmother had left her, but this was far more than she had ever spent on anything. More importantly, she realized she had no idea what she would do with a slave if she actually won the auction. She had never managed property, let alone a human being whose very existence challenged everything she had been raised to believe. $2,000, she called out, her voice carrying across the square with surprising authority. The crowd gasped. $2,000 was more than many families earned in a year. It was an astronomical sum for any slave, no matter how strong or skilled. Judge Whitmore grabbed his daughter's arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Stop this madness immediately," he commanded in a low, dangerous voice. "You're making a spectacle of our family." But Margaret shook him off, something wild and determined blazing in her eyes. "Don't chain him," she shouted at the auctioneer, who was preparing to transfer Cato to Colonel Beauregard after the colonel's final bid of $2,200. "I'll buy his freedom. To you he's savage, to me he's noble." The words hung in the air like a challenge to the very fabric of Southern society. Women began fanning themselves frantically, men muttered angrily among themselves, and Judge Whitmore looked as if he might suffer an apoplectic fit. But Margaret stood her ground, her chin raised defiantly as she faced down the entire assembly. $2,500, she declared, her voice carrying a finality that silenced all other bidders. The auctioneer looked around the crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the unprecedented situation. When no other bids came forth, he reluctantly brought down his gavel. "Sold to Miss Whitmore for $2,500. As the crowd began to disperse, muttering and shaking their heads, Margaret felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find her father's face twisted with a mixture of rage and something that might have been fear. "What have you done?" he whispered harshly. "Do you have any idea what you've just unleashed?" But Margaret barely heard him. Her attention was focused on Cato, who was being led toward her by two guards. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes even more clearly, along with something else, a wariness that spoke of betrayals and broken promises. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, with an accent she couldn't place. "Why?" he asked simply, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of questions about human nature and the seemingly random cruelties and kindnesses of fate. Margaret found herself at a loss for words. How could she explain an impulse she didn't fully understand herself? How could she articulate the sudden certainty that had seized her when she saw him on that auction block, the inexplicable knowledge that their fates were somehow intertwined? "I don't know," she admitted quietly, aware that her father and several other prominent citizens were watching this exchange with keen interest. "I only know that it was the right thing to do." Cato studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was naive, calculating, or something else entirely. Finally, he nodded slowly. "And what happens now, miss? What becomes of a slave whose mistress declares him noble?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them fully understood. Margaret realized she had acted purely on instinct, without any plan for what would come next. She owned a human being, a reality that filled her with both revulsion and an odd sense of responsibility she had never experienced before. "Now we figure out how to live with what I've done," she said quietly, meeting his gaze directly. "Both of us." As they stood there in the dissipating crowd, neither could have imagined the journey that lay ahead of them. Neither could have foreseen the secrets that would be revealed, the dangers they would face, or the way their lives would become inextricably bound together in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. Judge Whitmore approached them, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Come along, Margaret. We need to discuss this foolishness privately." He turned to Cato with undisguised contempt. "And you, boy, you'd better remember your place. My daughter may have some romantic notions about your nature, but I know exactly what you are." Cato met the judge's gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir. I know exactly what I am too." There was something in his tone, a subtle emphasis on the word no, that made Margaret look at him sharply. But before she could analyze it further, her father was pulling her toward their carriage, and Cato was being led away by the guards who would escort him to the Whitmore estate. As their carriage rolled through the streets of Charleston, Judge Whitmore's anger erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for hours. "Have you completely taken leave of your senses? $2,500 for a rebellious field hand? And that spectacle you made, shouting about his nobility like some character in a penny novel? The entire town will be talking about this for months." Margaret stared out the window at the passing mansions, each one built on the labor of people like Cato. "Good," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time they started talking about the right things." Her father's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "The right things? Margaret, you're a young woman from one of Charleston's finest families. Your reputation, your prospects for marriage, your entire future. All of it is now compromised because of this ridiculous gesture. If my prospects depend on my willingness to watch human beings sold like cattle, then perhaps they weren't worth preserving in the first place." Judge Whitmore fell silent, studying his daughter with a mixture of concern and calculation. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. "There are forces at work in this world that you don't understand, Margaret. Powers and interests that won't tolerate the kind of disruption you created today. That slave you bought, there's more to his story than you know. The Ashford plantation didn't sell him because he was troublesome. They sold him because he was becoming dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Her father hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "There are rumors that he can read and write. Not just a few words, but truly literate. Do you understand what that means? A literate slave is like a loaded gun pointed at the heart of our society." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, but not from fear, from excitement. If Cato could read and write, it confirmed what she had sensed about his intelligence. It also explained the careful way he had listened to the auctioneer's words, as if he understood far more than anyone realized. "Furthermore," her father continued, "there are whispers that he's been involved with the Underground Railroad, that he's helped other slaves escape to the north. If that's true, then by purchasing him, you've brought a viper into our very home." The carriage pulled up to the Whitmore mansion, an imposing Greek revival structure surrounded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. As they stepped down, Margaret could see a crowd of their household slaves gathered near the servants' quarters, whispering among themselves. News traveled fast in the slave community, and word of her unprecedented purchase had clearly preceded them. "Where will he stay?" Margaret asked as they climbed the front steps. "In the quarters with the others, of course. And he'll work in the fields like any other field hand. Just because you paid an outrageous sum for him doesn't change what he is." But as they entered the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, Margaret was already formulating other plans. She had bought Cato, but she had no intention of treating him like property. The question was how to navigate the complex social and legal realities that surrounded slave ownership while honoring the impulse that had driven her to bid in the first place. That evening, as she sat in her room overlooking the gardens, Margaret found herself consumed with thoughts of the man she had purchased. She had acted on pure instinct, but now she needed to understand what had truly motivated her. Was it simply humanitarian sympathy? Or was there something deeper, something she couldn't yet name? A soft knock on her door interrupted her musings. "Come in," she called, expecting to see one of the house servants. Instead, her personal maid, Celia, entered with a worried expression. Celia was a young woman about Margaret's age who had grown up on the estate and knew all its secrets and rhythms. "Miss Margaret," she said quietly, "there's something you need to know about the man you bought today." Margaret set down her book and gave Celia her full attention. "What is it?" "My cousin works in the kitchen at the Ashford plantation in Georgia. She sent word through the Underground Railroad network. That man, Cato, he's not what everyone thinks he is." "What do you mean?" Celia glanced toward the door, then moved closer and lowered her voice. "His real name isn't Cato. It's Joseph Freeman. And he's not a slave at all. He's a free man from Philadelphia. He was kidnapped 3 years ago and sold into slavery. Margaret felt the room spin around her. That's impossible. How could a free man be enslaved? There are laws. Laws that don't matter much when a free black man is traveling alone in the South without proper papers. Miss Margaret. Especially one who was working with the Underground Railroad to help others escape. Someone wanted him silenced, and they found a way to do it. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had not rescued a slave. She had purchased a free man who had been illegally enslaved. More than that, she had bought someone whose very existence represented a threat to the entire system that sustained her family's wealth and position. "How do you know all this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because 3 months ago, he managed to get a message through the Underground Railroad to his family in Philadelphia. They've been trying to find him ever since. There's a lawyer up north who's been working on his case, trying to prove his free status and get him released." Margaret rose from her chair and began pacing, her mind racing through the possibilities and dangers this revelation presented. If Joseph, she couldn't think of him as Cato anymore, was indeed a free man who had been illegally enslaved, then her purchase of him took on an entirely different moral dimension. She hadn't bought a slave. She had become complicit in a kidnapping. "Celia, are you absolutely certain about this information?" "As certain as I can be, Miss Margaret. But there's more. The reason the Ashford plantation sold him wasn't just because he was trouble. Word came down from Charleston that certain influential people wanted him moved away from Georgia. Apparently, his case was attracting too much attention from Northern abolitionists." A chill ran through Margaret as she realized the full scope of what she had stumbled into. Her father's words about forces and powers suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Had he known about Joseph's true identity when he brought her to the auction? Was her purchase of him part of some larger scheme? "What am I supposed to do with this information?" she asked, more to herself than to Celia. "That's up to you, Miss Margaret. But you should know that there are people here on the plantation who would help him if they could. People who've been praying for his freedom since the day he arrived in Charleston." That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with questions and possibilities. By morning, she had made a decision that would change everything. She would find a way to speak with Joseph privately, to learn the truth of his story from his own lips. And then, somehow, she would find a way to set him free, not as a generous gesture from a benevolent mistress to her slave, but as one human being helping another reclaim their stolen liberty. But first, she had to navigate the dangerous waters of Charleston society and her father's watchful suspicion. She had to appear to be nothing more than a naive young woman who had made an impulsive purchase, while secretly working to uncover the truth about Joseph Freeman and the forces that had conspired to steal his freedom. The game had begun, though Margaret didn't yet realize how high the stakes truly were, or how many powerful people would stop at nothing to prevent Joseph Freeman from telling his story to the world. As dawn broke over the Whitmore estate 3 weeks later, Margaret stood at her bedroom window watching Joseph work in the gardens below. In the days since Celia's revelation, she had managed only brief, carefully orchestrated conversations with him, each one confirming her worst fears and greatest hopes. He was indeed Joseph Freeman, a free man from Philadelphia, and his story was even more complex than she had imagined. Through whispered exchanges during her morning walks and messages passed through Celia, Margaret had learned that Joseph wasn't just a victim of kidnapping. He was a former teacher who had been documenting the illegal enslavement of free blacks throughout the South. His research had threatened powerful interests, including several prominent Charleston families who profited from the systematic kidnapping and sale of free people of color. But that morning brought news that changed everything. Celia burst into Margaret's room, her face pale with urgency. "Miss Margaret, you need to come quickly. There are men here, federal marshals from up north. They're looking for Joseph Freeman." Margaret's heart raced as she followed Celia downstairs. In the grand parlor, she found her father in heated discussion with 2 stern-faced men in dark suits. Judge Whitmore's face was flushed with anger, while the marshals maintained an air of official determination. "Ah, Margaret," her father said through gritted teeth as she entered. "These gentlemen claim that the slave you purchased is actually a free man who was illegally kidnapped. They have papers, a writ of habeas corpus demanding his immediate release. The lead marshal, a gray-haired man named Patterson, nodded respectfully to Margaret. "Miss Whitmore, we have substantial evidence that the man you know as Cato is actually Joseph Freeman, a free citizen of Pennsylvania. We're here to return him to his family and to investigate the circumstances of his illegal enslavement." Margaret felt the weight of the moment settling around her. This was the culmination of everything that had begun that day at the slave market. She looked at her father, seeing fear beneath his anger, fear of exposure, of scandal, of the unraveling of carefully constructed lies. "Where is he now?" she asked quietly. "That's what we'd like to know," Marshal Patterson replied. "Your father claims he's working in the far fields, but our search has turned up nothing." A terrible realization dawned on Margaret. During their last whispered conversation, Joseph had mentioned growing concerns about his safety. He had heard rumors that certain people were planning to eliminate him permanently rather than risk his testimony. Had those threats become reality? "Father," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Where is Joseph?" Judge Whitmore's eyes flashed dangerously. "I don't know what you mean. The slave is property of this household and—" "Enough!" Margaret's voice cut through his protests with surprising authority. "I know who he really is. I've known for weeks. The question is, what have you done with him?" The confrontation that followed would become legendary in Charleston society. Margaret publicly accused her own father of being part of a conspiracy to kidnap and illegally enslave free black citizens. Judge Whitmore, faced with federal investigators and his daughter's damning testimony, finally broke down and revealed the truth. Joseph Freeman had been moved to a remote cabin on the plantation's outer boundaries, where he was being held until arrangements could be made for his permanent disappearance. But when the marshals reached the cabin, they found it empty except for a note in Joseph's careful handwriting. "Thank you for your courage. I am free, and I will never forget your kindness. J.F." He had escaped during the night, aided by the very underground railroad network he had once helped operate. By the time the sun set that day, Joseph Freeman was already on a ship bound for Philadelphia, carrying with him documentation of the illegal slave trade that would eventually lead to the arrest and conviction of dozens of kidnappers and corrupt officials throughout the South. Margaret never saw Joseph again, but she received a letter from him 6 months later. In it, he thanked her not just for her courage at the slave market, but for treating him as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. He told her that he had returned to teaching and had established a school for formerly enslaved people who had escaped to the North. "You asked me once why I thought you bid for my freedom," he wrote. "I believe it was because you saw something in me that others refused to see. Not a piece of property, but a man with hopes, dreams, and a story worth telling. That recognition, that simple act of seeing my humanity, gave me the strength to reclaim my freedom and my life." The scandal destroyed Judge Whitmore's career and reputation, but it also marked the beginning of Margaret's transformation into one of Charleston's most vocal advocates for abolition. She used her inheritance to secretly fund underground railroad operations and to provide legal assistance to other free blacks who had been illegally enslaved. Years later, when the Civil War finally ended slavery throughout the United States, Margaret would look back on that morning at the slave market as the moment when she truly understood that freedom was not something that could be bought or sold, but something that belonged to every human being by right of their humanity. The story of Margaret Whitmore and Joseph Freeman became a whispered legend in both Charleston and Philadelphia, a testament to the power of moral courage and the unbreakable human spirit. It reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes, in the darkest moments of history, ordinary people can choose to do extraordinary things simply by recognizing the fundamental truth that all humans deserve dignity, respect, and freedom. In the end, Margaret had been right that day at the auction block. To the world, Joseph Freeman might have appeared savage, chained and dehumanized by an unjust system. But to her, he was noble not because she made him so, but because she finally had the courage to see what had always been true. And in that recognition, both of their lives were forever changed, proving that sometimes the most radical act is simply to see another person's humanity and to act upon that recognition, regardless of the cost.